In this tutorial, we'll be looking at what civil records are available. Civil records for the entire population were kept from 1864 onwards, but for those who were Church of Ireland, there are some civil marriage records available from 1845. Previously, using the 1901 and 1911 census, we conducted some research on the life of James Lowry from Ballygaddy in Tuam, County Galway. We're going to use the civil records to find out more about James and his family. From the census information, we learned that James was born in around 1899. We know that his parents by 1911 had been married for 15 years. That would give them an approximate marriage date of in around 1896. And his grandmother Mary Glynn had by 1911 been married for 30 years, giving her an approximate marriage year of 1881. So our aim is, using the civil records, to number 1, find the civil birth record of James Lowry, 2, find the civil marriage record of his parents, Michael and Bridget, and 3, find the civil marriage record of his grandmother, Mary Glynn. Hopefully, by bringing this information together, we'll learn a little bit more about the earlier generation and perhaps find out when the Glynn family first came to Kilbannon. So what exactly are the civil records? Well, they are the births, marriages and deaths of the country. The system was introduced in April 1845, and this gives us our first important date, because non-Catholic weddings are registered from this time. In 1864, though, it becomes law to register all births, marriages and deaths with your local authorities. Despite the fact that they are quite late, these 1864 and onward records are still a very, very valuable source. Civil records were collected by district, also known as General Registrar's districts. Usually the district was named after the nearest large town. So if you know your ancestors' townland, you can easily check what district it's in. It's useful to know that the districts were mirrors of the poor law. A useful online tool for checking administrative divisions is townlands.ie, or you can use a reference copy of a Townlands index, like this one. Another thing to remember is that, like the poor law unions, these districts don't always follow county boundaries, and some smaller districts were merged into neighbouring ones. Certificates are available from the General Register Office in Dublin, where you can visit in person, or through their office in Roscommon, where you can order a certificate and receive a research copy online. The initial form is sent in by post. If your ancestor was born in one of the 6 counties of Antrim, Armagh, Tyrone, Fermanagh, Derry or Down, you can check the GRO in Northern Ireland online facility, which was launched in 2014. This is because from the 1st of January 1922, births, marriages and deaths occurring in Northern Ireland were registered there. But for the period before this, researchers can access pre-1922 records, what are called historical records, in both Dublin and Belfast. You can check civil births, marriages and deaths in a number of places, but for us the most relevant is irishgenealogy.ie. Here the Irish government have added the historical births, deaths and marriages to an easily searchable website. Click on Civil Records, and on the left-hand side, like the census, you will see the simple search option. However, before we start, it's useful to know what civil records are actually online. You can click here. On this page, information is really divided into 2 sections. The top section talks about the indexes to the civil records of Irish births, marriages and deaths. They cover the period from 1864, and for those non-Catholic marriages, from 1845. The births are available up to 1919, marriages up to 1944, and deaths up to 1969. Below, we can see the information about what actual images are available online. So, if you wanted to search for a birth after 1864 and up to the period of 1919, that birth the digitised image itself, will be available online, unless for some reason there was a late or non-registration of the birth, and even if it was late, it should be included in that cohort. However, if you're looking for a birth, marriage or death after the period is indicated, you're going to have to apply online into the office in Roscommon using that postal form that I indicated. Now that we know a little bit more about what records are available, we can make a start in the search for James. We're going to try and look for his civil birth record. We'll click on Civil Records. And again, like the census, we can use the simple search form. So we add James's name and again his surname. We have to think here, like the census, about the variations in spelling, as sometimes you do have to check under various spellings in order to find the right person. We know that James lived in Ballygaddy in Tuam, which is in the Civil Registration District of Tuam. And we know that he was born, according to the census anyway, in around 1899. Sometimes though, these dates are only approximations. So let's go for 1895 to say 1901. We want to click the birth box here and we want to click search. So we can see here that we have the birth of a James Lowry on the 20th of March 1899. The district itself is Tuam, and we can see here the birth surname of his mother was Glynn. We know that his grandmother was Mary Glynn, so this is probably the right person. Here we have some further information. And if it was a thing I wanted to apply for an actual copy, a paper copy of James's birth cert, this is the information that I would need to use. I would need to have the ID number, the district, his mother's name, his own name, and his date of birth. And by clicking on the word image, we're able to see an actual image of the birth certificate itself. So we can scroll down, and as we saw on the census, James in 1911 was listed as James Stephen. He was born on the 12th of March in the parish of Kilbannon in 1899. He was male. His father was Michael Lowry, and again we know this from the census. His mother was Bridget Glynn. His father was a farmer. Michael has registered the birth, and the birth was registered on the 11th of May, so about 2 months after James was born. Next, what we want to do is locate the civil marriage record of James's parents, Bridget Glynn and Michael Lowry. Because Mary Glynn, James's grandmother, was listed as the head of the household in 1901, and because she was a widow, it's likely that that was the home place she married into when she herself married her husband. So when Bridget Glynn married Michael Lowry, he moved into that house, and later in 1911 he is listed as the head of the household. So the house at Ballygaddy, Kilbannon, is Bridget's home place, not Michael's. And because usually the bride would marry in her home parish, it's likely that that registration took place in Tuam also, the civil registration district for the Kilbannon area. First of all, we have to go back, and we're going to go back into the search results and back into civil records. Here we're going to add Bridget's name. She was Bridget Glynn before her marriage. We'll add the civil registration district of Tuam. And this time we're going to click marriage. We could just do a simple search based on this, but from the census we know that in 1911 that they were married for 15 years. So let's try for in around 1895 up to 1899, because we know James, their son, was born at that time. We click search. And we can see here that a number of people have been included here. But we don't see a civil marriage record for our Bridget Glynn and Michael Lowry. Maybe Bridget and Michael married prior to 1895. So let's change the 5 to a 0 and click search. We can scroll down And again, we can see no mention of a Bridget Glynn who marries a Michael Lowry. Despite the dates, we may have to consider the fact that Bridget Glynn and Michael Lowry don't have a civil marriage record. That's because the Irish genealogy.ie database isn't always perfect. Sometimes there are missing records, and sometimes there are index entries with incorrect links. From 1880, the responsibility for registering Roman Catholic marriages lay with the parish priest, so perhaps he didn't do this. Or perhaps the registration wasn't actually entered into the index books at all. We might also have to consider the fact, like in our search of the census, that they are listed in the registrations, but simply under a different spelling. So it's useful again to try and check the variations of the surname spelling. Next, I searched for Bridget Glynn, not in 1885, but in 1880. No luck. Then I searched for all Glynns in Tuam with no date specified, and again no luck. Then I searched for a Michael Lowry in Tuam between 1890 and 1899, no success. Later, I searched for any Lowry in Tuam from 1890 to 1899, no results. And lastly, I searched for a Michael Lowry, Lowry, in Tuam at any time, but without any luck. We may have to come back to this later. It's disappointing that we can't find the civil marriage record of Michael Lowry and Bridget Glynn, because that would have given us access to information about the earlier generation, at least information about both fathers of the couple. Now, for example, it hampers our search, because we can't try and find the civil marriage record of Mary Glynn because we don't know the first name of the man that she married. Instead, we may be able to find the civil birth record of Bridget Glynn, Bridget who later goes on to marry Michael Lowry. If we can find that civil registration in the district of Tuam, it will give us access to information about her father, and that will mean that we can search the civil marriage records for the marriage of that father to her mother Mary. Using this record then, and the other information that we've learned about the family from talking to our parents and grandparents, and taking note of any additional surnames they may have told us about, we should be able to cross-reference Mary Glynn, Bridget Glynn, and Michael Lowry in these records. Our next search then is an attempt to find the civil birth record of Bridget Glynn. We can add the civil registration district of Tuam here because we know that she was living there in 1901 and 1911, and that's likely where she was born, because when she married, Michael Lowry came to live in that house after their marriage. If you remember from the 1911 census, Bridget was aged 45 in 1911, so that gives us an approximate year of birth of 1866. We can start the search by being exact in terms of the year that we're looking for. We can tick the birth box and click search. Here we can see that there are two Bridget Glynns registered in 1866 in the district of Tuam. We won't be able to see from this information which Bridget is ours, if either, so we'll have to click into each and see if we can find out anything further about them. One of the main things we're looking for is a town, land and parish. We can see here that this Bridget was born to a Pat and a Biddy. Biddy wasn't our Bridget's mother's first name. Her name was Mary, and she wasn't born in Ballygaddy in Tuam, so we know that this is not the correct one. Going back to the search, we can then click the second option. Scrolling down through all of the names, we can see here that we have a Bridget, female, born in Ballygaddy, and her father's name was John Glynn. Her mother's first name was Mary, married name Glynn, formerly Diskin. I know, for example, that there's a connection between the Glynn, Lowry and Diskin families, and because of this I know that this is the correct birth record. It's not always this straightforward. Sometimes you'll search for a birth record and you can't find that either, and in that case an additional piece of research will have to be done to try and corroborate the information that you've gathered. We're now in a position to search for the civil marriage record of Bridget's parents, John Glynn and Mary Diskin. We're going to search first under John's name, because as I said earlier, it's likely that the couple married in the home parish of the bride, and we don't actually know where Mary Glynn ní Diskin originated. As a result, it will be easier to search for John and see what results are provided. We can search under the civil registration district of Tuam, because it's likely that Mary didn't come from very far away. And we're going to search for her marriage, so we tick the marriage box and click search. And what we can do is scroll through these names to see if we can see any record of a Glynn Diskin marriage. There's no record of that civil marriage. So while we broadly know where and when John Glynn and Mary Diskin married, we don't have the civil marriage record as evidence of that event. However, there is something odd about the marriage information provided by Mary Glynn on the 1911 census. There she states that she was a widow, and in 1911 had been married for 30 years. This would give a marriage year of 1881. But how can this be the case if her daughter Bridget was born in 1866? I think that this 30 years is actually incorrect. The census enumerator has either misheard or written it down incorrectly, and it should actually read 50 years. This would give an approximate marriage year of 1861, not 1881. And because this was prior to 1864, this is why we can find no record of the civil marriage at irishgenealogy.ie. These gaps in our research will inevitably change our research strategy. We could, for example, use the civil birth records to check the civil births of all of James's siblings as noted on the 1911 census. That information could become useful later on. We can also use a search facility to check for other civil marriage records in the family. Despite what Mary Glynn reported in the 1911 census, she did in fact have 3 children who survived: Bridget, Mary, and Patrick. And we can search for Patrick's civil marriage record, because I know that Patrick married a Mary Butler. Here we can see the civil marriage record of Patrick Glynn, or Patrick Dixon Glynn to give him his full name. Patrick married Mary Joseph Butler on the 29th of November 1898. The couple married in the Roman Catholic parish of Annadown. Patrick was aged 29 at the time of his marriage, giving an approximate year of birth of 1869. He was living in Turlough at the time and working as a physician and surgeon, while Mary Joseph Butler lived in Winterfield. Her father's name was Joseph Butler, and he was also working as a physician, while Patrick's father, as we know, was John Glynn, the farmer. Witnesses to the wedding were Burton F. Butler, Mary's brother, and her sister Frances Butler. As we know the approximate year of birth of Patrick Glynn, we can go back to those civil birth records. And here we have his civil birth record in 1869 in Ballygaddy, his father named as John Glynn and his mother Mary Glynn, formerly Diskin. Even though this wasn't what we set out to find initially, all of this additional information does bring us back to an earlier generation and tell us something about how long the family, the Glynn family in particular, are resident in the townland of Ballygaddy in the parish of Kilbannon. One additional piece of information we have is that by 1901 Mary Glynn was a widow. Her husband John was deceased. Patrick Dixon Glynn, who marries in 1898, names John as his father on his marriage record, but that record doesn't state if John is deceased at that time or not. Sometimes you'll see this written on a record, and it's a good endpoint if you're doing a search of civil death records. But we know that John was deceased before this time, because of information that we've picked up from our own family. We know too, in fact, that Patrick Dixon Glynn was quite young when his father died. He was aged between 8 and 10 years old. As a result, we can conduct a search of the civil death records to see if we can find any information about the death of John Glynn. The full details of John Glynn's death are not yet available online. So if I wanted to be sure that this was our John Glynn, husband of Mary, father of Patrick, Bridget and Mary, I'd have to order the certificate online. Using the 1911 census for a guide, we can try and find all of the birth, marriage and civil death records for the Glynn and Lowry family named on that census. Next time, we'll try and fill in some of the gaps in these civil records using some other primary sources. You can learn more about County Galway's local heritage by going to the website galwaycommunityheritage.org, where you can search the County Galway archive and browse through collections of local history and heritage material, including photos, documents, articles and personal stories.